Here to simply think together, reflect together. Good job, Robin. You get the ball of yarn. So we'll see who next has the ball of yarn on their head. John has it currently. If you go to the TRT Art Seeking Understanding website, there's this wonderful graphic of a man standing there that I can scribble for the head. And I just realized that's Anjan with the scribble of a head. It was brilliant. It's a good portrait. It's her best one. That's good. This is a loose time for us to think together and see if both individually we've made some leaps of progress or thoughts on our own, corporately, if that's the same. So it's just an open time of discussion for us. We do have these mics so we can kind of record and reflect on, so I'll pass these around. I'm right side of the room. Yay. He's left side of the room.
One of the things we want is don't want to lose the spontaneity. So even start talking, don't wait for this thing, and we're gonna run. So the thoughts just come, and you just got to kind of allow it to come. And the idea here is that you share with us just some thinking about what is it they take away, what you're taking with you back home, or what you learned, how you were expanded, or what things you think we should be paying attention. Remember, we're trying to develop a new area of inquiry. We call it, for better word, experimental theological aesthetics. How, from your viewpoint, we could move forward. What is it that you need, or how whatever is in your mind, that would be great. So this could be just random, or we could, if there is no volunteers, you're going to start. and you're just in front of me. What can you do? And then we just pass it, and then Craig goes, and then go. That so.
Yeah, and we're okay with two different frames. One, what am I personally taking with, thinking about different links that'll spur conversation, and ultimately, two, as Julio said, how and in what way does this relate to XTA in the development of that?
And one last thing, which we mentioned this, but the plan here, and we're going to talk more with you individually, is to develop a book, and so we are hoping that most of you, if not all of you, will contribute a piece to that effort.
Mm-hmm. We will be contacting you friendlyly,
soon enough,
in a friendly way, soon enough about that. This is where you earned your airport.
Yeah. First,
thank you,
volunteer.
This is probably more of a question that I'd love immediate response to from various perspectives. Because I so appreciated being in a space with people doing these various experiments and tests. And I'm kind of thinking in my context, it could be really enriching to do some very small scale, like unfunded examples of this. And would just be curious in hearing from some of the experimentalists and scientists in the room, like how could I do that as a theologian in my context faithfully to kind of contribute in a micro way to experimental theological aesthetics? So say if I just wanted to do this with my students, what kind of measures would I have to set up? And I don't have money for the biometric stuff and all the fancy gadgets, but what would be the best, and what would you suggest to me as the best method to do that on a micro scale?
Yeah, go straight ahead to Anjan. There you go.
So I'll start where I started, which is knowing the question you want to ask, right? Until you know a question, there's no research to be done. So, and the easiest way, survey methods are the easiest low-cost things to do and can be done in classrooms. So once you know your question, and then deciding what kind of questions in a survey are going to answer that, that'd be the simplest first step. And then from that, in the best of all possible worlds, that generates new ideas and new follow-ups, right? It could be what happens to these students after they leave your class, right? That you can track in some ways.
And I think you're pointing out this beautiful necessity, tension, and reality of XTA, that we need each other, that we can't necessarily do this without each other. And you play an incredible part there as a theologian, helping to identify the right questions, right? And to frame those right questions. The experimentalists know how maybe to get about that, but without that kind of theological framing, we're both just sitting in our own camps. So I would say it's not how can I do it on my own, and we would be saying, Wes, how can you help us, right? And that other way, we can help you in that way too. Yeah.
Well, I think I hope is that this is a community now, more of a community. This is the second time we do this, so some of us know from farther. And let's say one of the issues here, we know, is there going to be a quantitative or qualitative type of research? And what method you're going to use? And you don't need to know that. Suddenly you can contact some of us, and we could work with you and support that, right? You know, how many people you need to have, or what kind of, you know, I mean, what resources you need, not money, but, you know. So I think they will, if you're going to do it, you want to do it right. So you want to just not do it, just, you know, not just have the right question, but what procedures and so on. But hopefully this is a group of people that can support that, that effort.
And if not, I'll continue to keep you in a small room longer and feed you until we become a community even more.
So as one of three architects in the room, I think is it just four? Oh, no, you're back. Okay. You know, in a way, what you do doesn't exist without us, right? Because we create the spaces that you do your experiments in. So having heard, you know, my intentionality in the design of St. Gabe's and Craig's in his Christ Cathedral, is there any benefit in that, knowing that information? So you choose a space that has a living architect and a living pastor, right? Because obviously the pastor had a profound impact on the design of that space. Or is it immaterial to your inquiry, right? Is there any value in knowing those things, or interviewing the architects, or whatever, as part of that process? My question.
We're 11 architects for the record. We are the majority. We want to make sure that we have majority in case that somebody want to beat us up. We can defend ourselves.
It's philosophers that get frustrated.
Yeah. It's a question of numbers now. Anybody want to share thoughts?
Response to this?
I was just going to say something.
Okay. Response to.
Anybody want to respond?
Yeah, here. Here's my side here.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, one thought is that, you know, it seems like when we judge purpose, there's a paper by a guy named Michael Prenzing, and he's got a team of researchers who explored why we think about the purpose of different objects, and that's what includes sort of spaces. And the purpose of a certain space might have a lot to do with not only the intentionality of whoever designed the space, that's going to matter, right? But also its current use. All right. So maybe if someone designed a space to be, you know, a high school, but it's mainly used as a church, like that kind of current use might actually end up changing the purpose of that object, of that space. And like, so for example, I did my PhD at the University of St. Andrews. There's a beautiful church that we met in while I was there. Well, that church has since gone under, and it's now a beautiful library. Okay, and so the architect, the pastor, there's all these sort of intentions in that space originally, but now it's been sort of perhaps swamped by the intentions of the university administrators now, and how they set up the space for being a beautiful, inspiring library in some ways. Well, so we might suspect that from that research that Prenzing and Knobe and others have done, is that our judgments about purpose really come down to not only the intentionality of whoever created the space, but its current use, its efficaciousness at facilitating that use, so on and so forth. Yeah, I can send you the paper. It's a really great paper. Yeah, thanks,
Brian.
Oh. I will face it. Oh, yeah. Okay. He wants to use them.
Oh, all right. Well, thanks, everybody. This has been fantastic. I have loved so much being in a room with experimentalists and theologians and other philosophers and architects. I mean, to have actual architects talking about the buildings you've designed, I just think this has been fantastic. I feel like I've been more of a spectator, just enjoying all that I've been learning, and for me, it's been interesting on multiple levels. I as a philosopher, I'm interested in the aesthetic experiences and religious experiences, as I shared. But as I've also shared with some of you, I'm an elder at my church, and we're going through the process of trying to buy a building that we're going to have to do some architectural design to, and think about what kind of a space we want for our congregation. And so I've been taking lots of notes for those practical purposes, and I intend to put a lot of this into practice. One of the things that that has struck me is maybe a couple of ways to extend the XTA project or research program. If the goal is to start a sort of a new research program, it seems to me, as Anjan says, that the questions really matter. And we've focused on a lot of really important questions, and I don't want to take anything away from the important questions that we focused on. But it seems to me there are some questions that we haven't touched on that seem pretty important in thinking about sacred spaces. One of those is, what kind of an effect should we expect sacred spaces to have, or should we want sacred spaces to have, on the character and spiritual formation or development of people over time? Not just what might their momentary reaction be to the space, but if they really are having a significant experience of God's presence in a space, I think we should expect that would have not just momentary neurological, psychological, behavioral effects, but that we might see lives transformed. And in fact, maybe that's the thing that we ought to want more than the momentary neurological, psychological, behavioral impact. And so it seems to me that there's a way to connect the XTA program with other current research programs in character psychology, and in the study of character formation over time and character development, and what sorts of virtues, what sorts of traits might we be looking for. And that brings me to the next major research question, which might be, we've focused an awful lot on the way that sacred spaces have an impact on individuals in isolation. What kind of an impact might sacred spaces have on communities? Communities of relationships in which virtues like love can be exemplified, right? You can't love one another without there being another, right? And so if we're thinking about how do sacred spaces inform and impact people, seems to me that one really important question is not just the question about character over long term, but also a question about community. How might sacred spaces inform and shape communities of faith that meet in those spaces regularly? How are those communities being transformed? Because I think spiritual transformation happens at a communal level, not just an individual level. And so those are two, I think, very, very, very difficult. I'm not suggesting that there are easy answers here, but if we're trying to identify the sorts of questions that might drive XTA forward, it seems to me that one question is, how do sacred spaces impact character formation over a time and not just in a moment? And how do sacred spaces help to shape communities in the kinds of ways that we would want to see? And how could we test for that? So.
Good. Okay, start talking so they don't lose your idea. But she has his first. I'll go there and they go there.
I like the ideas that you're talking about right now, that it's community, I like what you're talking about, that it's community, and it's not just the moment of behavioral observation and neuronal response. But I think the long-term arc might be what I would call the loveometer, and can we talk about beauty? Can we talk about love? These are not easy topics, but it has to do with affiliation, and it has to do with loyalty and investment, emotional investment. And if that's there, then if you have an institution that does that, which is a combination of its people and its places and its programs, then people change and stay for a long time.
That loveometer shot. Oh, I'd like to give him one of those.
I need to use this? Okay. Sorry for missing today. It's just like the status of the world right now didn't make me in a mindset to be in a room with you all. So I really apologize for missing today. Little emotional, but I wanted to mention something. I think you talked about. There are some voices that I think are missing into this conversation, and I feel like I've been studying digital religion for the last 12 years, and I study a lot about material religion. And I'm trying to recall names now of scholars, but if you're familiar with Bridget Meyer and other people that work on material religion and like so probably you know more than me about material religion. But I also collaborate with people from media studies and religious studies and sociology a lot in terms of the practice of religion in the digital realm. And we've seen a lot of this happening, especially during COVID. And now with everything happening in the world, I feel like there might be more instances where we're going to move more towards the virtual world. So we need to start thinking about not just the physical aspect of religion and religious practices and spirituality. I don't want to say just religion, but also spirituality, and how we can accommodate in when there are disasters happening or like people that are displaced, like what we're seeing now in the world and war zones. And so how can we bring some of that community and some of that, need for comfort, right, through these digital tools that now are available to us, and especially with the surge of AI now that is taking over and being so biased and being very unethical and challenging environmentally and ethically. I think we should bring more voices into this conversation. So I would say media studies, communication, sociology. Yeah, sorry.
I will add to that. I think when you deal with community, which is a different scale, right? A different methodology are necessary than we have used. I mean, ethnographic research for this will be a good one. Action research will be another one. Very powerful methodologies. Sociological studies. So there's a whole other series. Maybe that's got the lovometer, yeah. So that's how it comes from there. But that's something I think that this group we need to. Well, we only could invite so many people, but that we all our stuff, and of course the digital. And I will add one more thing. I will just put it there, and we can continue in this topic or some other one. It's the question of AI, and I think Nesreen, of course, Brandon and Anjan. I think it's inevitable. This is not inevitable in the negative sense, but the data is such and the world is going that I think we need to also begin to see how we could use that tool to illuminate and help us in this investigation, especially when we have huge amount of data. So something to think more about, maybe talk more about. Who's next?
I've been really impressed by the thoughtfulness of our architects. That's been a lot of fun for me. And I haven't thought very hard about architecture in my life, but man, it is a profound art form. So that's one of my takeaways. Like one thing I glean from a lot of talks is that architecture encodes ideas. It encodes a philosophy or a theology. But I've gleaned from other things people have said that it also facilitates our shared way of life. And I'm not sure of any other concrete thing that has those two things in common, right? So that's sort of profound to think about. As far as XTA, I share the sentiment of like, we focused a lot on sacred built space, and that seems to me that could only be one of the subtopics. And I want to stick up for the ecological subtopic that I think is should not be seen as like less central than the built environment. And then also at the same time, aesthetic values that are not dependent on what we sense, because things can be beautiful even that are not available to the senses. Like, tell me if you find this beautiful. Trees cannot use the nitrogen that occurs in the environment because it's locked in a compound. So something has to happen to break it free. And so here's one of the ways that nitrogen breaks free. Lightning strikes and rends the nitrogen from its compound. And then rain falls and carries the nitrogen to the earth like mercy. and then the tree root systems can use it. But the lightning is made by the atmosphere which the trees make. So the trees are feeding themselves with lightning. No? Okay, so that's a process. So that seems to me exceedingly beautiful, but it's not something you learn about it through the senses, but to grasp the beauty, you must understand the process. So another way we could push theological aesthetics is to consider aesthetic values that are not instantiated by sensible entities like processes.
Paul is volunteering.
Yeah, this has been awesome just to have everybody in the room, and maybe two thoughts: one about XTA, and then one about the architecture as well. With the XTA thing, over the last couple of days, I've been sensing a slight tension where you have, like, on the one hand, you have theoretical disciplines, and then you have experimental disciplines, and there's a tension there. How do we translate? How do we communicate the same concepts? I've heard, like, abstract art and representational art and all these different things, sensory experiences, aesthetic experiences, and it got me thinking of, I happen to have it in my bag because I'm teaching on it this week back at school. But I've got C.S. Lewis's essay, Myth Became Fact, where I just want to read the last, how he concludes this essay and then make a point about XTA, perhaps. But he's talking about how in Christianity you find this perfect blend of reason and romance, and they kind of pull them together in this perfect way, where for Lewis, he discovered that Christianity was like true myth. So it's story, it's the romantic part, it's the beautiful part, but it's true. And then he ends this particular essay, though, this way, and with all the metaphors and the discussions of light and those kinds of themes that I was hearing today, he says, if God chose to be mythopoetic and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth. And then he ends, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and delight, addressed to the savage, the child, the poet, and each one of us no less than the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher. And so what I take from this, perhaps, for XTA is that, like, XTA will be at its best when we engage, like, the particularities of our faith and not just like generic spirituality or something like that. And when we really seek this sort of beautiful place where all these dichotomies come together, and it could be just in the particularities of our own religious traditions that express that in the way that I think Lewis is doing here. So that's just something, thinking about that tension. When it comes to architect, which is new to me, I've been listening to Matthew for a couple years, and so I'm sort of familiar with what you guys are doing here at Cal Baptist. But something, I think, Jacob, you said this when we were in one of our discussions today about how buildings, we build the buildings and then the buildings shape us. And that idea makes a lot of sense to me. I think, we talk about culture, how culture is what we make of the world, and then that culture, like our phones, they in turn shape us in malformative ways in the case of the phone. And so I think that's probably one of my big takeaways, is being more sensitive to the built environment and realizing that it is shaping us in ways that I don't think I've been aware of. And so that's what's been really helpful, listening to the discussion, especially from the architects in the room. And so with that, though, I want to add one question to Adam's list of, like, here's some other questions that might be helpful for XTA. And one thing that I didn't hear much of, but I think would be interesting is the question of the imagination and how these built environments really shape our imagination and our conception of the world that we find ourselves, and the kind of cosmos and the sense of place. Like, we talk a lot about space, but really the rich word that has deep theological meaning within the tradition is this concept of place. And even Lewis, he lamented the change in the modern era in our language, where we no longer talk about the heavens, but we talk about space. And maybe this return to this sort of richer concept that I can now appreciate, though, from this week. So yeah, thanks. It's been really rich.
Just wanted to mention the quote was said by Alain de Botton. So you should read his book, Architecture of Happiness.
Actually, it was by Churchill. Yeah, and they were done. He used it, Architecture of Happiness. I think the question of dwelling comes to me. I think some of us, that the only way that we profess anything or live is through inhabitation. And that's the connection between this higher realm of experience or connection with others, community. Eventually, everything comes down to living the world, being in the world. And that's the built environment begins to be essential.
Something I think maybe we didn't talk about enough was the ways that these buildings are often more than just churches. Sometimes they're shared spaces with arts organizations. They give space to artists for studios. They have daycare centers. They have soup kitchens, they have all kinds of other things. Sometimes they're shared congregations of different, even religious groups. And I wonder how we could experiment or know about those places that are trying to do more work than just serve one single religious community or worship community. And then I also wonder about, for many of us, we're not going to be building brand new expensive churches. We're going to be worrying about maintaining the crumbling ones that we have and going through processes of renovation and restoration and maybe adaptation. And I'm thinking about the long term, as we were saying, a church isn't just for one generation. It may be for a lot of generations, and we may not even know who those generations are going to be. So I'm wondering about thinking about the bigger picture, a more complex one about what churches and sacred spaces and what they're for. And sometimes they're not even churches. Sometimes they're botanical gardens or something of that sort. Like your wonderful garden.
Something that we haven't said, but we should say out of disclosure is that there is a power game that that architects could use by having the data, right? The evidence-based design empower the architect to go to a client and say, this is not my feelings, subjective, but this is something that actually works. So I want to disclose that because in a way, it helped us architects to move forward with what we think is a better world, but hopefully also empowers the clients to see whether an architect's proposal makes sense. So hopefully that's the other side of this, the evidence-based design movement, which is pretty large in architecture, and it's growing. Milton's book is all about that, really, in some fashion, but it hasn't really dealt with the sacred at all, or very little. So it's a whole space of opportunity there. People are avoiding my face. They're not looking at it.
That's right. We can just like stare. There we go.
Don't look, Mark.
Well, I'm still getting over the fact that you allowed 11 architects in this room, so kudos to you. But I've enjoyed learning from you all. I think that's kind of my primary takeaway is there is a set of tools. There is language here, common language. I remember hearing you use the word thin not too long ago, and then I heard it 57 times the last 2 days. Like, okay, I understand. It's part of the common lexicon of this group. And I think there's a lot of power in that. I think about, for myself, how I mentioned this, but the fragmented nature of the culture, the competing mental models, all this, like it begs for some of that common language. I also think I've thought a little bit, the last couple of days have allowed me to think a little bit differently about our work. The project work we do are essentially experiments. They're custom solutions all the way through. And so I'm left wondering, what our role in these little experiments are and how we've talked like, well, how do we report back on that as experiment? So those are some thoughts.
Thank you.
I would echo thoughts that have been expressed thus far. Just really incredibly stimulating. I was going to say a few days. It's been all of like 48 hours, right? And it's just difficult to believe that. I've really enjoyed learning from all of you in countless ways. It seems to me that one of the themes that kept coming up was the idea that these spaces and the project of theological aesthetics, broadly speaking, is about engaging with beauty, yes. But what came up over and over again was the notion that formation is in play for the kinds of spaces that are created, if we think about what the goal is, that unfolds over time. And so I think it could perhaps be of service to think about different understandings of beauty that can relate to that temporal dimension. And what I have on my mind is, with this elastic term, right? Beautiful, what does that mean? We might immediately think of the visually presented, or perhaps sonically presented art, or something in the natural world. But I think we do well to think about beauty having a narrative structure as well, such that things that are beautiful themselves play out over time. So thinking about the lightning that rends the atmosphere, right? So not visible to the senses in a certain way, but that is a story, that's a narrative that moves through time in a manner that we might feel compelled to call beautiful, right? And I think it even does work for the term. If one of the things we're up against is the trivialization of beauty, the thought that it's not terribly consequential, when one moves into that narrative mode, it seems to me one can account for depth and difficulty and challenge, suffering, evil, in ways that at the end of the day, you might still be okay with calling beautiful, even perhaps with certain qualifications and hesitations, right? But in other words, when beauty goes narrative, it goes deep, and it can account for, I think, a lot of the struggles that humanity finds itself in. So I guess just to say that theological aesthetics, experimental theological aesthetics, as this term beauty gets considered, to think about the beauty of the narrative arc perhaps being one that stands alongside, is nourished by the beauty of the visually presented or sonically presented material.
Maybe I say something about my major takeaway, and there's a lot to say, is Mark's revealing to me, or to us, through his really well articulated lecture, that Christianity is a ascetic faith. To me, that's so profound and so liberating, and so fostering action in a way that of course is incarnation. Of course, I hear that, right? But suddenly just, yeah, it's to me, it's incredibly powerful, and it really gives me tools to operate in a way that before I couldn't as powerfully, and get resources like theology and so on. So I appreciate that. I mean, everybody, but just to make a point. You can start.
So two other things. One of them is that we haven't really talked about complexity as a thing. And I think that human experience is enriched and enhanced by complexity, and it's already inherently complex. But in terms of designing space for religious experience, is there a way to judge how much complexity is good and how much complexity is too much? I think the word richness is the target. And how do we actually make that a topic for research? I'm suggesting that it would be a great topic for research. So that's one thing. The second thing is, some of the people here are people of faith. Many of you are, and some of you are expressing your interest in architecture. Let me be the architect who's really impressed with your faith. And I'm taking that away as one of the most important things that I'm going to go home with, is this memory, this experience of people who have faith and are coming together to share in different ways, whatever their objectives are. But the faith is the abiding part. I'm impressed, very impressed.
Something that's profound for me about these 48 hours is how you've enriched my understanding of what I do. Excuse me. So I'm very grateful. Thank you. Anybody?
I wonder if what we are talking, by and large, all the discussion have focused in directly or indirectly in Christian faith. And I wonder if XTA could be extended beyond, let's say to Islamic, Judaism, or perhaps to Asian religions. Of course, the tradition in the West has been by and large, all of it, most of it, not all of it, through the Christian faith. But I wonder, and if that, of course, we don't have much of a representation here enough, I guess, of the discussion. What does the floor think about that? How we bring that into, or should we? Maybe it's too much already what we're trying to do to start adding. But I can see, use for that as well. Some principles that could work.
I think it may be an interesting question that we just reflect on as a group. Each of us wear different hats. Some of us wear multiple hats: theologian, philosopher, architect, experimentalist, scientist, historian. When we think about XTA, as we think about defining this new field, how do you see your role? As a theologian in XTA, this is what I can bring. As a philosopher in XTA, this is what I can bring. Is there even a sense in ourselves of what our contributing role might be, or is that still confusing? Or let's do it.
So one idea, so I can sort of speak to both these things. So I think part of it, like I'm really enthusiastic about the prospect of going global, right, with XTA. It's going to be difficult though, right? There's all sorts of challenges that will come from that. People speak not only literally but figuratively different languages, right? The kind of understanding and the kind of how the narratives that we're framing these things, the way we're framing these things is going to be fundamentally different. I think that's really valuable to sort of tap into that, to see those sort of different stories that are getting told, the ways that these things are being conceptualized. But it's really difficult to build that community. And so I think one of the things that's going to be really important if you want to go that direction is trying to figure out a way to build social capital, right? So like having conferences, having a place where people can spend extended time together to build those relationships and to try to sort of really sincerely sit down and try to understand, okay, like you said this, can you help me understand how that works for you, right? And this, I think, ties back into Matthew's question for me, because I think in my own experience in interdisciplinary research, analytic philosophers can be sort of a pain in the rear end in many ways. But one of the things I think philosophers can be really beneficial at, or really good at, is sniffing out, concept use. And like sometimes we say the same thing, but we mean very different things by it. And so that's really helpful when it comes to interdisciplinary work, when people might be talking past each other. But it can also be really beneficial when you're talking about people coming from entirely different faith traditions, cultural traditions, so on and so forth. Having an awareness to sniff out that sort of conceptual differences to help us better understand and locate disagreement, to help us better facilitate understanding. I think philosophy can be really helpful in sort of trying to identify some of those concepts.
I've got one. Just to say, I'm so glad we're recording this. That comment about analytic philosophers is now in the record, and I didn't have to say it. No, I love that. In the same spirit, I don't know that I have that much to offer here at the end, and I'm like too close to having just presented like this morning to not want to have callbacks to things I said. But I will just make a pitch for the sharing of slides or papers. So I will say, it's so helpful to me to have, some time since this compressed, as Mark said, it's only been 48 hours. It feels like so much more to return to things. So it's totally an opt-in scenario, but it would be so helpful to me, I know, to kind of come back and look at things that I didn't get a picture of or something on the screen. So just, there's no judgment, but I think we're going to have opportunity to share our slides. I mean, Jacob's got them all already. So, but yeah, in that spirit, I think, I mean, I when I was sharing, I was saying, trained as a theologian, teaching art history right now, but then I've been in this world of theological and empirical aesthetics research and experimentation. Yeah, and just in in hopes of avoiding any overshare, I'll just say like the imposter syndrome is like intense, and the sense of do I belong in these spaces was a little bit to overcome. And I would just say, it to your question, Matthew, of like what do we have to offer? Let's not overestimate like the things that we draw security from, or the things that we think, oh, this is who I am and this is what I have to offer. All that's wonderful. For the interdisciplinary research that I've just had a little bit of an exposure to, kind of shared interest or kind of shared energy around common questions can really take you a long way, it feels like. And that can supply, to Ian's point, some of the social capital that necessary to kind of work with somebody that doesn't understand your discipline or doesn't understand your starting points. It can really go a long way when you feel like, like I'm not sure how this is going to work, but we really, it seems like we really are curious about this in a deep way. And I don't know, that there's some momentum. Let's see what happens. That might not be the most like, straightforward, but that's a little bit of the lessons I've learned thus far, and I'm so grateful for it, because the connections and the relationships and this 48 hours has been another instance of it. It's just surprising and wonderful.
Yeah. So I've got it right here. Yeah, Julio, as far as your question goes and what Matthew said, I think that this has already been brought up, which is that middle term of experimental theological aesthetics is theology, and I really like how juicy that term is. When we're doing theology, we're not studying religious activity, we're talking about God, right? Which is something that God enables. But there's not a single theology that we're discussing. There are various theologies that we have, which are often tradition. And so actually, yeah, I would encourage the embrace of particularity in theological expression. And I think it's helpful to bring out those distinct traditions and theologies that we have, that especially as they play out in practice, including things like the spaces that you inhabit, what they mean in your particular context, how they're informed by your tradition. And so some of the really valuable parts of our discussion have been those times when the differences become a little bit clearer, and actually almost easier to talk about when we have when the differences are a bit more apparent. So I loved hearing about synagogue design and sort of what that means, or thinking about Catholic and Protestant spaces, or we had a wonderful discussion of LDS worship spaces earlier, and then how to think through that. And so, yeah, as far as the things that we bring, I do think it's really valuable, lovingly, joyfully, to talk about, okay, my tradition interprets sacred scripture this way, and thus we speak with from our tradition and practice distinctly, and to always be wary of trying to revert back to a sort of lowest common denominator account of religious life, right? Because there are all these beautiful and wonderful things that differ. So we got to hear, some incredible theology, and I love Mark's talk last night. And I think Balthazar is right about so much. It's super helpful. But I think that there's probably even more maybe even I could have done to sort of bring out, okay, well, I come out of the Wesleyan tradition. We're the sort of country Episcopalians, some people say. We just occupy this sort of funny space, and that shapes so much of the churches that we build and what we value, and the sort of art forms of Wesleyanism, that I think sort of being even louder about some of those distinctives could be really useful for our discussions.
Yeah, so I just wanted to piggyback on some things that Taylor said. So I think, so I work at a small liberal arts college, and we think about the liberal arts and why we like the liberal arts and rah liberal arts, all that kind of stuff, right? And one of the things that I find really motivating about the liberal arts, but I think is also going to be applying to projects within XTA, is a lot of the questions that we're interested in, a lot of the questions that we're wanting to address simply can't be sufficiently or fully answered from a single discipline, right? And so you do need these multiple voices speaking together, trying to converge together on these kinds of questions. And just a paper I want to plug, if you're interested in this, is Nathan Ballantyne's paper, Epistemic Trespassing. And this is sort of a paper sort of talking about how, like, whenever we try to speak on these issues that, our field will speak to, but also we are cognizant that other people's fields will speak to. Is there a worry that we could be trespassing on being too authoritative about our conclusions if we haven't really consulted these other fields? And it's a fantastic article and really easy to get into. But I also just wanted to mention, I share the conviction that we should share our slides. As many of you may have noticed, I tend to be a bit manic when I'm presenting, put way too much stuff out there than I can say anything about. I included on my slides all the different context conditions as appendices. So even though I knew there was no hope of ever getting to those, I included it into my slides, and I'm more than happy to share those if you're interested in seeing those particular context conditions. So thanks.
I was thinking about Julio's question about how including other theologies, other religious traditions, seems to me, I mean, intuitively, I'm like, yeah, that sounds awesome. I guess I can see two visions of how XTA might proceed with that just are making trade-offs in the goods they bring. And one of them would be super inclusive, any religious tradition. I want to hear from the Buddhists and the Shintos and whoever else about how they think about aesthetics and their sacred spaces. And I have to say, I found, Milton's discussion of synagogues to be really insightful, both to look at the commonalities and the contrasts, the things that it brings to the surface. I imagine that would just be, you get more of that if you have like some Shintos in the house and we're right. But and then if we're going to do it that way, I think what Philip said is exceedingly wise. We shouldn't then revert to a lowest common denominator. We should just be leaning into our particulars with an understanding that we're not offending each other or trying to exclude each other. We're just owning where we're at, and that's what makes it interesting. But the other vision would be where it's more, this is about Christian theology or Abrahamic theology, and we're going to get people who share this common ground to go deeper into what is shared. And that seems to me just a different benefit, I guess. So there may be trade-offs, and maybe there are just spaces for each of those things to happen. And analogous things could be said for Buddhists. They might benefit from getting their heads together and going deeper on what their commonalities are, right? So, yeah.
So I was thinking about this, what's my big takeaway from this symposium? And one of the things that stood out was this quote by a Finnish architect, Juhani Palasma, that some of us know and are friends with. But he said, the task of all art and architecture is to defend the authenticity and autonomy of human experience and to reveal the domain of the sacred. So as I was thinking about what we've been trying to explore and looking at this authenticity of human experience, how do we respect the autonomy of human experience? How are we revealing this domain of the sacred in albeit many traditions? We've talked a little bit about this loveometer. I love that. I'm going to quote you now, Adam. Yeah. But I've also been thinking about, well, is there also this notion of a happyometer or a spiritualometer? in many ways. And we've been touching upon this. And recently I was listening to a lecture by Arthur Brooks from the Harvard Business School, and he was saying about the neuroscience of happiness. What it really comes down to in business is that people have this idea or connection to faith, something bigger than themselves, which is kind of what Juhani Palasma is talking about. This also idea of the connection to family and friends and the community, which is the levometer, and then ultimately to the legacy and the work that we're doing, and what are we leaving behind, and what roads are we paving for future research. And Brian and I were talking a little bit earlier about this idea of Ruskin and building for time, leaving a legacy, right? We've kind of lost that in our consumerist culture of this throwaway architecture. I've already had buildings that I've designed been torn down, and it's you too, and it's horrible to think that. And why can't we build buildings for future generations, like these structures that have lasted the test of time, that are still having an impact on human understanding, such as what I presented on the Pantheon? And why can't we have that attitude, leaving this legacy? And I think in some regards, XTA really embodies a lot of these concepts.
I just wanted to say that you can kind of just pause and just feel the power in the room. You know, you watch all these presentations and just the spiritual power, the intellectual power, the experimental power. And that was really striking to me. And it was just going in and going out, and sometimes over my head, and just developing this common language was so important through this whole 48 hours. I mean, just the information that I've gleaned, and just the passion and just the common language was so important. And I think that's why this is so special. And I feel like if we opened it up to different religions, we would have to do maybe 2 different tracks or something, because there's such power here talking about Jesus, and, you know, open and freely about that. And there's just that power that you just feel. So.
I mean, I suppose a related question might be what you make of sort of opening up the conversation to, I mean, applying to incorporating the voices from like the nuns and the duns, right? People who are sort of done with religion, they're none of the above when it comes to religious perspectives. We saw that they're having a similar, a lowered aesthetic, or a lowered experience, but getting more of them involved in these conversations would be something I'd be personally really interested in. Going forward as well.
That was important for us in our study.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, another facet as we consider to expand or not, and I would actually support Brian's support of Philip in terms of getting into the particulars, making sure we don't kind of distill down to some common core. But one feature of that exploration that could be illuminating concerns the ways in which beauty is thought of in these different religious and philosophical traditions from around the world. And in particular, beauty doesn't suffer the same travails elsewhere as it does in the modern West. And that could bring entirely different understandings or distinct understandings of that category that could in turn be quite informative, I think, for the project of constructively thinking about beauty in the Christian tradition and elsewhere, but beauty of a different sort, at least in some regards, because it's informed by other understandings from around the world.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it made me think of a really wonderful book that hasn't been mentioned over our time, The 6 Names for Beauty. Yeah, so great. And I was just looking at the summary again, not just beauty in our English, but Takalan in the Greek, wabi-sabi in the Japanese culture, Yafa in Hebrew, Hozo in the Navajo culture, and Sundara in Sanskrit. So even thinking about those concepts, whoa, but and each one of those can be understood in their particularity, but also how that can be mutually informative for standards and what we're testing for. And so, yeah, so good.
Just a comment or a question on, for my own understanding of the other senses as a part of aesthetics. I know as an architect, I'm very curious about things like where smell fits into our experience, and the auditory part of the experience is a big thing, a part of our design, and even the sense of taste and where that fits into all of what we're doing. So I just wonder if there's a way to incorporate some of that over time.
Well, there's more. Some people say 20 senses, right? Your sense of balance, the sense of heat and cold and humidity, and which in architecture sometimes is incredibly powerful. I mean, the movement and kinesthetics and so on. Juhani Palasma talks a lot about this and how our culture has become a ocular centric. And in reality, that's why when we talk embodiment, I was so glad to see there was a couple lectures focused on embodiment, and it's much, much bigger than the five senses, way bigger. And even embodiment begin to suggest the idea of spiritual senses that many of you talked about too, and the expression of that. So that, yeah.
And for Derek, there are some other groups that we're working on architecture in this, but Art Seeking Understanding Grant has multiple groups, some of which are working on sound. Really phenomenal international teams working on sound and sacred space, and other kind of groups working on other subslices of this. Yeah.
Maybe I'll give you that. One thing that I think is a little bit on the weak side of this group meeting, and I think is the lack of more experimentalists, more Anjans.
We need more
if that's possible. I don't know if it wants more Anjans. I mean, after seeing that,
there's only room in the world for one Anja.
Yeah, but I think the kind of the three limitations or what each of these experiments are, what we could do with science. I think I have come the hard path, and I consider myself now experimentalist. But there is such misunderstanding by the social science or traditional science, or what really science, empirical science, can and cannot do. That I think X part will advance. We need to more on that, a lot more, and not just the subject oriented, but also the communal, the larger scale, both one person and multiple persons methods of measuring things.
And I think in a lot in the TRT community, there's a lot of psychologists.
Yes.
But there are other experimentalists outside of psychology that might be helpful.
Yes. Wes, you had your hand up? Oh no, you had it. So you were close enough.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I just wanted to say that this has been also an amazing 48 hours for me. I've learned so much. And my thinking, I mean, I have studied spiritual atmosphere for my dissertation. So I've been thinking about these things, and like my perspective on these things has been like profoundly shifted, which is on the one hand very like disconcerting, but on the other hand very welcoming, right? And on the question of expanding it to different cultures, I would say also I think one voice that's missing is the more people from the Orthodox tradition, because especially if we're thinking about aesthetics, I mean, they have maybe their richest, well, I don't want to make any absolutes, but like they're quite there at the top with the richness of iconographic tradition. And then also to think about, so at least in Catholicism, it's shifting from the West to Africa and Asia. So just thinking about, and India. So just thinking about the future of Christianity, what countries it's going to be in, and can we bring more of those voices into the conversation? And then the third thing is coming back to Anjan's point about the importance of the question. One thing that I really appreciated in the document that you prepared for the, well, I'm sure you and others prepared for the conference was the list of questions. Yeah, but I think it's so important because, I mean, even the question of like, What about the communities? How are they being impacted?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
the foundation of XTA is the finding of the questions.
right. So I'm almost thinking, can there be this ongoing effort to add our questions to it? Because I think that could be a help for everybody. Yeah.
Well, I think I want to say thank you to Isabel and Nesreen and Carl, right? They're here because they want to be here. You know, they're not speakers. They pay their way here. They are committed to this, and well, you are part of the team because you wanted to be here, and I think that in many ways is I'm really appreciated that. So thank you for being here. Yes. Yeah, you had to say a few things here.
At least one word in. At
least one.
I'm hearing these comments from Paul and Adam and even from Robin about imagination and formation and legacy. And I think about Matthew's question of, what's the role of the architect in XTA and what's the role of XTA for an architect? And I think we've come to a consensus, whether we're trained architects or not, that the built environment is not a neutral thing. It's something that carries meaning and presses on us, whether we're paying attention to it or not. And if we're going to talk about formation and if we're going to talk about imagination, I think the role of XTA for us as architects is helping to give us better language to tell the story that we're trying to tell. I think, I think about the just small conversations I have with Derek. I wish they could have been longer. For us in the evangelical space, I think we're really seeking after a reclamation of sacred space, a reclamation of the message that we want to convey in our built environment that's just not been conveyed for the last 50 years at least. But I think XTA provides us the opportunity to refine the language. What exactly is it that speaks well? And how do I use more of that? How do I leverage that more effectively? I feel that I'm a practitioner trapped in an academic's body, and which is fortunate and unfortunate. But because I have that practical bend, it's what do we do with it? Even when we were just lamenting, what do I do with this after listening all weekend? And I think this is the role of XTA for me. It's not that we can figure out some magic chord that just everybody instantly converts, but it's something that helps me cultivate better soil for the story that we have to tell, which is such a wonderful story. How do I cultivate the soil to tell it well and communicate it well and have people experience it both very intentionally and explicitly, but also more implicitly and intuitively as I think a key role for us.
And one thing I want to say is that I started working with Templeton Religion Trust maybe 6 years ago in 2020. And since then, and particularly in the last few years working with Matthew, I think I grew up Catholic as a Catholic, and I always have so much suspicion for our brothers, the Protestants. We call it Protestants, no evangelical Protestants. And through my working with TRT, and certainly since I work very close with Matthew, in fact, I have less suspicion from Jewish or Islam than from the Protestants, if I'm honest. Because we're kind of, maybe because we are Christians, we feel competition. I don't know what it is. And what I have learned is through these years and through Matthew is totally the opposite. And I think if anything, this can confirm we are really brothers and sisters. It's very emotional. It's good to feel that. It's good to feel it like that.
With that, I think that's the perfect last word. Brothers and sisters, thank you for being here. Thank you. Thank you to all your spouses and your children for letting you come for 48 hours. Say our thanks to them. And let this just be a start of a community, a start of friendships individually and corporately, a start of collectively looking for the right questions, a start of bringing what we have and bringing the best to the table as theologians, as philosophers, as architects, and not stepping backwards, but stepping forward into that. And let this be a moment where you go home and dream about the chapter you'll write for the edited volume of XTA development. We have one more event before we've officially dismissed as we get to feed again. Probably a nicer meal at all. It's about ready, not quite yet. But before we leave, let me, if you will, permit me the opportunity to pray for us as the host in my Protestant native tongue for us all. Father, I thank you that brothers and sisters sit around this room. I thank you that you've equipped the church with the hands and the feet and the arms and the legs, and in this room, a lot of brains. I thank you that you bring insight and discernment to these men and women around the room, matched with a passion and desire to know how and in what way and to what extent we and others connect with you. Let our interest be that resonating reminder that it's not just us looking at paper and interesting ideas, but there is an object to our inquiry, that there is a culmination to our questions, and that is you. Thank you so much for this community that's formed, and let it be continuing on in the great endeavor of understanding how beauty can lead us to you and how experiments can understand that better. Bless this food to our bodies today, and bless the coming months and weeks and our edited volume beyond that. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.